So good to see you all. And yeah, so I am from North Carolina. I am from Winston-Salem area. So I have returned back home to this area. My story is somewhat unique. I grew up in a independent Baptist church. So I did not grow up in Southern Baptist or Southern Baptist life. When the convention, Dr. Brown was talking about this, when the convention turned way more moderate, my parents made the decision to leave Southern Baptist church life, and I attended an independent church all the way through my high school years. And during my high school years, the state of North Carolina really turned over and became conservative once again as the conservative resurgence happened in the convention overall. North Carolina was one of those states that really turned. So when I was a child, my dad was our choir director at our church. We didn't call him a worship leader. So he was the one who led the 2 hymns and the choir song every week. And my mom was our piano player. And so I grew up in a house where my parents served and did worship ministry. So watching my parents do worship ministry made me never want to do worship ministry ever. Because church people are mean, and there's two areas of the church life that I would never have wanted to work in. And that is kids, because you're responsible for their children, their babies. And the other one was worship ministry. And my brother was actually a kids pastor for 15 years, and I'm a worship pastor. So we both got not what we wanted, but what God had for us. So when I went to school, my undergraduate degree is from the North Carolina School of the Arts. It is here in Winston-Salem. It's a conservatory. So in the same vein of Juilliard, Manhattan School of Music, those types of things. I was going to study classical music and wanted to be a professional musician. So I wanted to, after graduation, leave North Carolina and move to New York City and work as like a collaborative pianist, accompanist, and do some conducting. That was my dream, and that's what I was running hard after. After my freshman year of college, a friend of mine called me and told me that their worship leader at their church had resigned, and would I be interested? And honestly, I had no idea what I was getting into. So I told her no at first, and then she's like, well, it pays $100 a week. And I'm like, I'm in, because I was a starving college student. Some of you might be able to empathize with that. So I took my first church, I would love to say, for God's call, but it wasn't. It was for the money, and it was no money. So I don't even know why I took it. But I started leading worship. I remember walking into the pastor's office, and he showed me like this really old Vineyard Hosanna music video. I think it was Don Moen, maybe. And Don Moen was sitting at the piano. Yeah, name that blast from your past. Don was sitting at the piano, and he was like leading from song to song. And I was like, man, I can play the piano. I can sing. I can do that. And so I was like, the first Sunday we were in service, and I was like, okay, this is where I got to do a transition. So I'm going to say, let's lift it up to Jesus. We're just going to start simple. And I got tongue tied, and I said, let's rip it up to Jesus. That's when I knew that I was like in over my head and had no idea what I was doing. But my first church was like 250 people. Those people loved me. I was there for about 3.5 years, and they laughed off all of my immaturities. And really, there was a group of men that took me under their wing and just shepherded me and grew me in the Lord. And I went from that church to another church in this area that was actually somewhat planted by Calvary Baptist at that point, which was kind of the mega church in this Winston-Salem area. I was at that church for 3 years. It was about 800 to 900 people. Again, I was probably in over my head, but I had no idea that I was in over my head. I was just young enough and stupid enough to just try things, and the people responded, and they followed me. I went from there to a historic church in Augusta, Georgia. It's in downtown Augusta, Georgia. It was the first time I was in a mixed cultural church, very diverse congregation, and I really enjoyed my years there. It was a little larger than the church that I left here in Winston. It was my first time to leave home, to leave like North Carolina and do ministry elsewhere. I would say all of those churches had kind of a blended bent to them. They had choirs, they had orchestras, they had bands, but it was all kind of one and the same. And then I had the chance to move to Charlotte, North Carolina, and to start something completely different. And that appealed to me. So I moved to Charlotte from Augusta and started a contemporary service at First Baptist Church Charlotte, which is kind of a downtown church. And if you know anything about Charlotte, it's the largest city in North Carolina. And I was right there in the heart of the movement. So Charlotte Panthers, their stadium was like, I could see it from my office in Charlotte. And that was super fun because we were starting completely from scratch. Had nobody leading worship, no instrumentalist. We were starting a service completely with no predisposition to what that could look like. And so for 2 years, I did that, and it was incredibly rewarding and difficult. It was like planting a church within a church. And then God opened up the door for me to move to Gastonia, North Carolina, at another incredible church in the state of North Carolina, Parkwood Baptist Church. And I was there for 13 years. And that's where I raised my family, basically. And God allowed me just to see some incredible things at that church. That church size, part of the reason I'm mentioning size is because that's one of the reasons why Dr. Brown asked me to talk today, is just I've served at churches of all different types of sizes, and would love just to sort of share some insight into that. And even if you have some questions about that towards the end, I'd love to jump into that. But that last church that I served at grew. Our very first Easter there, they were so excited because we hit 800 people. And when I left that church in the 13 years that I was there, our last Easter, which was post-COVID, we had 1,600 people. So the church doubled in the time that I was on staff there. At that point in the church's history, I became an elder there, helped just move the needle, definitely went from being just the worship pastor to doing a lot more leadership outside of that. My father got Alzheimer's a couple of years ago and was really not well about a year and a half ago. And we made the decision that we would pray about coming back to my hometown. And we didn't tell anybody. We just prayed about that. And shortly after we started praying about it, the pastor at Calvary Baptist, which is the church that I lived across the street when I lived here in Winston originally 20 years ago. And I would pull out and go to my little small church of 250 people and think, wouldn't it be cool if I was in a church like that someday? I had no idea what that was. But, and now I am at that very church that I would say that about every 20 years ago, every day as I pulled out. So I returned to Winston-Salem and became the worship and arts pastor here at Calvary. We are a multi-site congregation. So we have campuses on 2 different parts of Winston-Salem, and mine is sort of the centralized campus. On just this campus, we run like about 1,800 people on a Sunday morning just on this campus, and then our other campuses are increasing. And it has had a worldwide reach. The worship pastor who was here 2 worship pastors back, who mentored me before I left Winston-Salem, actually has an office around the corner from me. He still does the senior adult ministry here, and he's still around. So it's really cool to work with a mentor. And they've only had like 4 full-time worship pastors in their history. So they're all kind of long tenured, which is a really cool thing to have. So I've seen kind of it all. I've experienced lots of different, the changes in style. So when I started 20 years ago, it was all about choirs and orchestras, and that has obviously shifted for better. I would say our centerpiece now is congregational song. That's the most important thing that we do. And we're able here to do that some weeks with a band and vocal team and worship leaders. And some weeks we do that with a choir and a much smaller orchestra than we used to have, but do that with those types of expressions. We're working right now on a bluegrass set for an event that we have coming up. so we're able to sort of do it all, and it's super fun, and I'm enjoying my time here and just enjoying being back in my hometown. So I would say this: if there are things that I have learned throughout my ministry, it's the biggest thing that I have learned is to keep the most important thing the most important thing. And the most important thing is the gospel and how the gospel plays out in your church. And I think when I was coming through, the most important thing to me was having the cutting edge program, or the cutting edge instrumentation or technology or whatever it is. And that's not the most important thing. And God really broke me at a turning point in my ministry where some personal things happened to me and my wife. And he broke me of my pride and really reintroduced himself through the word to me. And that changed the course and the direction of my ministry. So from that point on, I can say that I've sought desperately to make the most important thing the gospel, and singing the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, making the gospel central to everything that we do. The other thing that I've really learned in the last 10 or 15 years is leadership development. And that's coming alongside of the next generation and training them up to be the next leaders. My time is short. I'm aware of that. I'm 44 years old, and I hope I got a lot of years ahead of me. But in Christianism and how the church is being played out through time, my time is relatively short. And so I want to impact the next generation for the sake of the gospel. So I'm investing in people that are younger than me and giving them opportunities to grow and to lead and to work it out like I worked it out. And like those men in that first church shepherded me is something that I'm really passionate about. And I would say to each one of you, as you are in seminary and moving out into local churches, or maybe even be in local churches, I'm still working with our student bands here, investing in them, coming alongside kids and encouraging them. We've got a new kid. His name's Evan. You can pray for Evan. I think God's got his hand on Evan. He's an excellent worship leader, but he has no idea what that means yet. So I'm always trying to find that person, that next worship leader to sort of invest in and to see God's kingdom grow through. So even as you're embarking in ministry, make leadership development kind of important tenet. And then all the other stuff, man, you're gonna serve churches where you're going to serve all different types of churches. I've done Christmas musicals. I've done just you name it. And I've probably been a part of it at some point. And that's sort of indigenous to the people that you serve and where your location is. In my opinion, there's not an exact way that a church should look. And if you pattern your ministry after a particular congregation, you're probably going to miss something in that process. So just be open to understanding the culture of your people, understanding the artistic culture of your people, and then grow things from that. And so those are things that had I known back in the day, I would have totally done things completely different. So the gospel, most important, do leadership development and just know your people and love your people and shepherd your people well. So those are kind of the basic things that I have. So what I wanted to do in this time is really open up for questions, because you probably have way more important things that you're thinking through, or way more thoughtful things that you're trying to think through than I am from where you guys are at. So I'd love just to open up the floor to ask whatever you guys want to ask, and I will be happy to answer it in any way that I can. So am I going to be able to hear everybody?
Yeah.
Yes,
I think so. I'll tell you
Yeah.
what, let me stop talking and then you all say yes.
Yes.
I can hear you. Very cool. So who will be the first to ask a question?
Brock?
how do you effectively integrate, like you said, you're preparing a bluegrass service. How do you integrate different genres of music without being distracted?
That's a really great question. I think first and foremost is make the important thing the important thing. So if the gospel is centerpiece, and we see, especially in the New Testament, congregational song being kind of like primary. So we know that it's when the body gathers together, there are specific things that we are to do. And the singing of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs together is primary. But we don't have a real pattern of what that is supposed to look like instrumentation wise. But I think that if you're going to do something like that, you have to make sure that it's still very congregational friendly, meaning that there's space for the congregation to sing. So even if we do a bluegrass set, and I actually have done this before, it's still our normal songs. We just put a twist on it. So the congregation isn't sitting there looking at us like, why are you doing this? This is super weird and crazy. It seems natural to them because they already know the song and they just fall into it. And then it just is wrapped in something else. I also think you have to be really careful. Like there are weeks where I lead with just an acoustic guitar player and a string player. And then there are Sundays where we have the full choir, full orchestra type idea. And I've gotten our congregation over the last year used to it being a little bit different every week. So if I were to throw down on a bluegrass set and it just be totally different than anything, and we only led with a band every week, and then all of a sudden we have this thing, I think it'd be a little bit weirder than it will be this time around. I'm also doing it this season. I'm doing it as a Christmas as a part of a Christmas event that we're doing to sort of introduce this concept. So I'm not throwing it in on a Sunday morning and it's just totally strange, if that makes sense. But the big thing is make sure that it's congregational friendly. You don't want to have a bluegrass band just playing the, I'll Fly Away, and we never sing I'll Fly Away or whatever, if that makes sense. Great question though. What else?
Go ahead.
Okay. Hey, I'm Luke.
Two Lukes.
Hey, Luke.
So, what would you say is the biggest challenge that you face in a church that maybe has about 250 people in it? And what's the biggest challenge that you'd face in a church the size of Calvary?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I would say, so when I was in a church of 250 people, everything that we did was sort of on my back in a sense. Like I had no staff, so I had to sort of create it, and the leadership skills needed in that type of setting are great because you've got to have lay people to do every position. Like I couldn't physically run sound, lead worship, play all the instruments. You know what I'm saying? So I had to like raise up leaders that were production people, that were care group members in choir or whatever, because I couldn't possibly get to everything. So I had to think about how to recreate or how to reestablish myself in all these spaces within people. So there's a ton of leadership development that needed to be done immediately. In a church like Calvary, I do have a staff team that carries on a lot of those things. So I have a production person who does he lives in audio world, and then we've got a videographer, and then we've got somebody who does the band, and then we've got somebody who does the orchestra and those types of things. We've got people that we pay to do those tasks, but then I'm tasked with leading that team. So they're similar and different all at the same time. The other thing too is it just gets bigger is not always better. FYI, I used to think that the grass was, when I was young, I used to think the grass was always going to be greener on the other side of the hill. And then I realized that it's greener. Yes, it's greener, but it's because cows pooped all over it. And the reality is that when you get to the bigger side, the other side, you just fall into a lot bigger potholes in a larger church. So you have to, I don't think they're that different in that regard. You have to be careful and wise. The scripture tells us that he who lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, and he would give it abundantly. And I feel like more than ever in my ministry, I'm asking God for wisdom for every decision that I make. because it affects so many people. And if I were to tell my 19-year-old self in that church of 250, what's really important to do is to ask God for wisdom, because I made some really unwise decisions at 19, 20, and 21. So I think in a lot of ways they're similar. They're just really different. They look different than in different settings.
Okay, before we go to the back row with the next question, I just want to highlight something that he didn't make a point of it, but he was serving as the person leading worship at 18 or 19, 20, 21. I was too, and I remember that. And he's talking about all the ways that people that needed to extend his young self grace and all the time it took to learn the hard lessons. You cannot think you're going to just get your skills and then drop in at 29 or 30 and be excellent in a big church. It doesn't work that way. If you do get into a significant, just my observations, Chad, yeah, I'd love to hear you speak to this.
Yeah.
When the guys and ladies I've known that have gotten into what might be considered by people on the outside as significant situations, significant positions, because of their skill set. Well, there's the progression of their skill set. All of our skill sets, they usually progress faster than our character. And that can be a problem. So if you start serving in hard places early, rather than, this is too hard, I'm just going to do school right now, you may not be helping yourself as much as you think you are. And that's just me hearing what he said.
Yeah. So my son is, I have twin boys. They're 19. They're both incredible musicians. One's in Manhattan School of Music, and he's a French horn major there. And then my other son is leading worship, has recently started leading worship at the Summit Church in Durham, which is J.D. Greer's church. And he is serving at one of their Mebane campuses, their Mebane campus, which is kind of the furthest out southern campus there. My son last spring at church called me. He was here with me at Calvary. He was playing electric guitar with us, leading worship here. We had a small church in our area ask if we had anybody that we knew that we could send out there as a supply. And I told Cody that he would learn more being in that congregation than anything I could teach him, that he needed to go in and love those people well, take them from where they were to the next worship guy. And so he went out into a small congregation where he had like a percussionist and I think a couple of singers, and he had to like revamp their planning center and all these things. And he was doing this all as a high school, like he just finished his senior year of high school and he's doing that. And he learned so much in those 3 months that he was doing that he went and became a part of a congregation in Greensboro called Mercy Hill Church, which is one of the fastest growing congregations in the country. And then that led him to really start leading at the Summit again, he was just a fill-in at the Summit, and they've sort of moved to him and kept him. But I told him, like, you have to do the hard work of being in that small setting and learning, and he learned an immense amount. He used to tell me, like, all the things that I would do wrong, like, hey, Dad, you should do this. You should think, until he got in it himself. And then he learned that, that he didn't really know everything that he thought he knew. So yeah, I think what Dr. Brown is saying is, I hope you all are serving in local churches, but more than that, hey, I would just challenge you, like, while you're in seminary, college, wherever you guys are at, if there's a smaller church in your area that has nobody, I would go to that and start from the beginning. It's easy for you to, I mean, I would love it if all of you came here. But it's easier in a situation like ours to just go in and do the cool stuff and not realize the labor that went into building the cool stuff. Like, because the building process is what I would think is where my leadership skills were honed in the most, if that makes sense. Like, I learned how to lead people when I was in a smaller church trying to just figure things out. So it's a great challenge. Like serve churches and serve smaller churches there. You'll learn a lot.
How much of the singing do you lead, and how much of the singing do you have volunteers or other people lead, and how do you think about that?
Yeah. So if you're going to do leadership development well, then you shouldn't be leading every song. And that can get a little messy, obviously. When I came on staff at Calvary, I was starting, a lot of things were starting from scratch. They had been through it's a long story, but they had actually been through kind of a rocky period, especially on this particular campus. The last worship pastor had left and they had an interim, and it was kind of a long interim. So when I came in, I was leading a lot more than what I do now, but I'm still leading a lot more than I actually want to. I would say in a typical set at my last church, which is, 2 years ago, I would have been leading there. If we were to sing 4 songs in that worship set, I would only be leading 2 of them, vocally leading 2 of them. Most of the transitions I was probably still making, but a lot of my lay leaders and interns and people who were in kind of our formal leadership development track were doing a lot of leadership there. It's not my desire here to, honestly, if I'm being transparent, it's not my desire here to still be leading like I'm leading now in 10 years for sure. I would much rather move to a support role where I'm encouraging younger worship leaders to take the reins and go with it. God has granted me some, how do I want to say this? Like vocally, I still have kind of a more commercial sound. So I don't think I sound really old, but let's face it, as you get older, you start sounding older, and nobody's going to want to hear me sing the latest, greatest worship song in 20 years. So my
Chad
voice
has
is probably
he has one of the best tenor voices that I've ever heard. I'm just telling you guys, he's super legit right here. He's being
well, you're being really nice, but so I know that I know my time with holding a congregation's attention vocally is going to wane. So, and I don't want to be, I still want to be in the room where it happens, I'll quote Hamilton. But I don't have to be the person in the middle of the stage with the spotlight. I also think that teaches your church the wrong things about your role. So I consider myself a pastor shepherd more than I consider myself a musical artist. So if I'm pastor shepherding people, then I want other people to be encouraged and lead. And then we can evaluate that. What went well, what didn't, how'd you feel? Those types of things. Those are the conversations that I'm having. I think maybe in the Southern Baptist world, we got really, you're still seeing it, like rock star preacher, rock star worship leader. I just don't see that in scripture. I mean, as great as Paul was, he was always investing in someone else. In his writings, that that's the case. And he sends people to specific towns and cities in his place. So I want to be that person who pushes somebody else in the limelight and not take the limelight and say, here I am, look at me.
Chad, I want to ask you something related to that, though. I don't know if any of the students have run into this, but maybe we're just similar enough in age that when I started trying to hand off vocal leadership of songs to other people on the platform, I actually had people in my church to come and say, why are you doing this? We called you, we're paying you because we want to hear you sing this. Have you ever encountered that? And if so, how did you deal with that?
I have, and I probably, I don't think at this point in my ministry, I've had somebody say, we're paying you to do it. Why are you giving it to somebody else? But if I let somebody lead and it's not amazing, or how do I want to say this? You guys know you're a room full of
level of
students. Yeah, that's great. That's so much of a better way of saying it than I was going to say it. So if there just didn't hit on all cylinders vocally, then I might would have somebody push back, but I would really try to help that person understand, like, if we never give opportunity to that, then how does the person get better? And you should encourage and pray that they will get stronger. And so if I think I'm modeling that though more than I'm actually speaking to it. So, and I think even in my interview process here, I made it very clear that I would not be the primary, I would not always be the one leading everything. So I think it was clear even coming in. But good question.
I think Chloe's been waiting a while.
And then Lena was waiting too. So I have a question about singing in multiple languages and other styles of music from other cultures, and how you just kind of, I don't know the demographics of your church. I don't know anything about the diversity, but if there is some, how often or in what ways do you incorporate scripture reading, praying, and singing in other languages?
So I will be honest with you, that is something that I don't have as much experience in. I was, and Dr. Brown would know this person, I was watching, a friend of mine is one of the worship leaders at Brentwood. Her name's Oksana. Some of you may have met Oksana. I watched her this summer. She was filling in for Travis Cultural there. And Oksana like sang a song in Spanish, sang a song in Romanian, sang a song in English. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm such a failure. Like, she's so amazing and I'm terrible. But I thought the way that she did that, like my wife and I were sitting there going, we were just in tears because it was so well done. That I thought, there's got to be space for us to be able to do that here. Traditionally speaking, Calvary has been kind of a refugee church. So we have a Karenni congregation here, a Vietnamese congregation here.
What was that first word?
Karenni.
What
So
is, I don't know that word.
So they're from Corinth area, which is interesting. There's a whole group of people that moved to Winston from that area of the world. And so we have a Nepali congregation. We have 2 Hispanic congregations, but traditionally speaking, they have been separate. So my biggest challenge is when we do like Good Friday service, or we do things that are like campus-wide worship nights, then that's when we address like, okay, our language congregations, how do we welcome them into this thing where predominantly it's all English speaking, because those congregations are smaller. But how do we address that? And it is a challenge, and I have not figured it out yet. At best, we've had, even if we sung it in English, we put like Spanish translations underneath, or for other songs, we'll put different types of translations. So we're tipping our hat to the other campuses that are here, but I wouldn't say that we've done a great job with that yet. I think there's other models that are better than me, and I'm still learning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So whenever you were saying that there was like the shift of the choir and the orchestra to like a more like band praise team led, how, like, one of the things that choirs do in the regular basis is opening a space for older people to be able to still serve and use the gift that the Lord has given them. So in that shift, how do you welcome older people to sing in your praise choir if they have like the desire to do it, or is it like mainly young people led because it sounds better?
Yeah. So when I was back in Charlotte, and I was at First Baptist Charlotte, so that's where I started like a contemporary service within a very traditional congregation. And we didn't seek out for that to be young. I was much younger then, but we didn't seek out for that whole thing to be young, but it turned out to be a young group of people leading. And I would say that honestly, I only spent 2 years there. I don't think God has created me to be very good in that environment. It's not the contemporary or modern sounds that's the issue. It's that I like having a choir behind me because it collectively looks like the body. And it's funny, like my son was over last night and he was talking about memories that they had as kids, and they love being around like choir people because they loved them and they were older and they were influencing my children in their faith. So when I went to the church in Gastonia, which I was at for 13 years, we had a choir a part of our ministry there the entire time I was there. As a matter of fact, that was one of the struggles during COVID, was that we couldn't do that part of it. And I think we lose something when you don't have it. You can certainly argue that, choir is a model in the Old Testament, and we don't know if it's a model in the New Testament. I think from a church history standpoint, it's always had an integration in church history. It's been a part of liturgies forever. So I think at some juncture you have to say, okay, even if it's not explicitly said in scripture, there's a pattern to it. So here we do still have a choir. I would say it's about 60% of the time they're on the stage. And then the other 40% of the time it's vocal team. I don't have an age limit on my vocal team members. We've got older people who serve in both our band and our vocal team who are just as strong as our young people are. So I don't think there's an age limit. I do think there is a distinct sound to youthful voices that I would love to that I love, but there's just a beautiful sound when all generations, all tribes, and all tongues come together and worship God in spirit and in truth. And I want our Sunday morning gatherings to emulate that as much as possible. So here at Calvary, we do have a choir at this particular campus. Some of our other campuses don't. They're different expressions, but here at this campus, we do. And I hope to always have one a part of my worship leadership. I think it's valid.
Yeah, Landry.
So I'm not really sure how to ask this question, but I'll kind of preface it with yes.
I may not be sure how to answer it.
Okay, well, I'm from Mississippi, and so in a lot of the Baptist churches there, it's the hymnal or bust when it comes to picking out worship songs, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. However, there are new songs that are just as useful as sharing the gospel as the ones from the hymn. So how do you broaden the Christian music taste of a congregation without it seeming like you're erasing the tradition that's already there?
Yeah, man, that is a great question. So I think number one, you really do have to understand your context. If I were planting a church, not doing a revitalization, if I were planting from scratch and I were in the middle of Portland, Oregon, I would still have hymnody a part of my worship expression. Would I necessarily have to do a hymn every week? Probably not, because likely that if you're planting a brand new congregation in the middle of Portland, Oregon, you may not have any context for that. They're not going to know the difference between Amazing Grace and Come Behold the Wondrous Mystery. Both are going to seem like a hymn to them. But I think that you really need to understand your context. And if I were to go into, like, for instance, here, we do a hymn just about every week. They don't always sound, they're packaged differently. So sometimes I'm trying to update it arrangement wise or whatever. We don't have the organ. We're not doing like high church hymnal stuff as a part of our regular routine. But I would be amiss if I did not have hymns a part of our congregation here. the other thing too is there's such a great arsenal of new hymns being written. And so sometimes I'm not sure my congregation actually knows that In Christ Alone is not an ancient hymn. I think so. I think that sort of serves to fill that space because it's written exceptionally well. And Christ Alone is just brilliantly written, lyrically and musically. And it's easy, it falls on a person like a hymn. And sometimes I don't, unless they're in the know, they don't really know. So, I think you could introduce things like that in a context where it's only been hymns only, and that might go over well. I don't think I would jump right into like, Battle Belongs in a congregation that's only been into the hymnal. I think I would ease that in a little bit. And honestly, how I've done that through the years is that may be done in student worship. And so I would do like a student takeover morning and get students leading it. And you'd be surprised at what older congregations will jump aboard if they see kids actually doing something.
Back in the 90s when only crazy Pentecostals were doing contemporary worship. If the students took over Sunday morning, the students will be allowed to do anything basically within reason, because the desire is so great to see them, worshiping. So
yeah, absolutely. So let the students take over often, or put them in your regular rotation, and you can do Battle Belongs. But yeah, I think I would really know my context well,
Hey, Dr. Brown, can I hop on with the question?
Hey, go on, James.
Hey, Chad. My name is James
Hey,
Cheeseman. My question is kind of piggybacking on the last two questions about, I guess, maybe worship styles broadening and things like that. And it seems like, in your context, you are attempting to, incorporate a lot of different types of expressions that would, reach different generations and different things like that. One thing that's kind of been on my heart as a worship pastor is preparing people to worship in different contexts, because they won't necessarily always be with you, and just understanding that worship is broader than how we do it, here, or how we've done it here. And I mean, I see that from students that think that, youth camp worship is like the best thing ever and nothing else is good. Or senior adults thinking that, camp meeting is the best thing ever and nothing else is good. Or just having no context for anything liturgical. And so I've always thought that there's a benefit to trying to expose people to different ways that they might worship that are good and healthy and beneficial and edifying, that they might not be used to, just kind of step at a time. Because I think we kind of need that in our world so that we can worship in other places and worship well and not be stuck in my own, little bubble, realizing that worship is bigger than just my expression. So how has that played in for you, especially in your context, in a important, urban area? People come and go. How does that fit into your philosophy? Does it fit into your philosophy, or how does that fit into your philosophy as a worship pastor?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, and one of the things I want to make very clear is 15 years ago, when I went to the church outside of Charlotte that I was at for 13 years, from day one, I never talked style ever. I never said we're going to do a contemporary song, we're doing a traditional song. For one, that is defined so you could talk to one person, they say something's contemporary, and talk to the next person and it's not. So I never talked about style at all. All I ever focused on was proclaiming the gospel and being scripturally sound, gospel saturated in everything that we did. And that was the drum that I beat. And then as things morphed, we were able to, okay, so this week, it's going to look a little different, but we're going to do the same things. Like, it's going to be scripturally sound, gospel saturated, those types of things. And I think if I I think what we did there especially, and the reason I say this is because I kind of see it in my own kids. Like my son is in New York. In New York, he's going to Redeemer Presbyterian, Tim Keller's old church. So when I went with him on the first Sunday, the liturgy was beautiful. And they had a mandolin player. The piano player was the worship leader. They had two female singers who sang every song. One was African American, and oh my gosh, she was the most brilliant singer I think that I've ever heard live. She was amazing. And then the other girl was a white woman who had a just different style altogether. And they sang mostly hymns and mandolin, acoustic guitar, bass guitar, piano, drums. I think that was it. And then these two singers. So it was a different type of expression. And the next week he went, and I think they had like a brass quintet. But if I'm thinking about New York, and Dr. Brown will think this is funny. When I got there with him, nobody was at this church. Nobody was at Redeemer at that point. And so we're sitting there and thinking, oh, it's going to be a complete bust. Cameron's really excited about this church, and there are like 30 people. Well, in typical New York fashion, 2 minutes before the service, the place fills up and there's everybody. And in that moment, I realized that I'm a senior adult in this room full of young people. And I'm thinking, like, the only older people in that place were the pastors and the worship leader on the piano. Everybody on the stage was really young, but it was super eclectic worship. But I think it was reflective of their culture. Like they came from, I said African American. I don't know. She might not have been African American. She might not have been American. She might have been from somewhere else. I couldn't tell. I know she's brilliant. But I know there was like someone who was clearly Asian playing. And so I'm wondering if it was just a melting pot of people. Yeah. And with that, I want to say that the style was secondary to the liturgy. Like the liturgy was absolutely beautiful. And so I think like that doesn't change wherever you go. Several years ago, our missions pastor brought me in a recording. He's like, I want you to hear this. And it was an indigenous people group that had written their own worship songs. And they didn't have chromatic tonality. They were singing in like some sort of tonality that I didn't understand. And it was, if I'm being honest, it was ugly to my white American ears because it was so foreign to me. It was ugly. But then as I started to listen to them and the passion in their voices and understanding what they were singing about, I just began to weep. It was so beautiful because it was gospel saturated. And all the walls that I had built up in my mind of what I thought music should sound like were torn down. And it was just something so beautiful, and it was expressed differently. So I think, again, I go back to the first thing that I said is make the most important thing the most important thing. And I think, and I've seen this in students, they'll leave your church, and if they're looking for gospel saturated, scripturally sound worship, they might end up in something that sounds completely different than the context they left, but they'll end up in a situation where that's the most important thing. So I think that's how we prepare people to move. Like if you end up planting a church in wherever, you're going to have to adapt to the culture if you're going across the globe, but you're not going to adapt the message. The message is never adapted to the culture. The message is the gospel. I hope that makes sense.
Who's that? Okay, go ahead.
So you were there, you've been a worship pastor through the transition to contemporary worship and stuff. And there are a lot of churches specifically down here that still predominantly do just hymns. Is there a way to, even if like the church right now doesn't really have a youth group, and I'm just trying to figure a way to help broaden their language, not change it, but expand it more than just hymns?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start with with songs, modern songs that sound like hymns that are written in hymn style. So Matt Papa, Matt Boswell, Sovereign Grace music, the Getty stuff. Sometimes the Getty stuff is so colored in their heritage that maybe it's harder to, it's not as palatable to a congregation, to a traditional congregation. It wouldn't be as palatable. And what I mean when I say that is just because that the kind of Irish twist that they have to some of it, it might not be as easy to translate over. But certainly songs like In Christ Alone, those types of things they translate into every world. So mine would start there. I also would just, have an acoustic Sunday where you have a cajon player and a guitar player, and do like the Shane and Shane version of some of those songs or hymns, and just open them up to like how stylistically it could sound different. I just wouldn't, if I'm in a congregation that uses piano and organ or even orchestra and only sings hymns, I just wouldn't drop a 5-piece band into that service and say, deal with it. You've got to shepherd well through that. One of my favorite stories is when I went to my church in Gastonia. They had done a contemporary and a traditional service, and they had pulled the two together. And the pastor had done some exceptional things to like get them ready for that transition. And it was beautiful. I never had any complaints at all. But one of the things that had been done really poorly was acoustic drums. It was too loud, wasn't mixed well, was unbalanced, and they just had a really bitter taste in their mouth on acoustic drums. So a couple of things he told me was they won't do long guitar solos, they don't do repeated lines, and they don't do acoustic drums. So, so I was like, great, I got these things to work on. So they had digital drums, which are like, I think they should be thrown out. I just think they're the worst thing ever. Sorry, if some of you have digital drums in your church, there's probably a drummer in the room that's like, yeah, that's the best. But that's not my favorite sound. And so I knew I wanted to get rid of them, but I was trying to think, how do I get rid of them where it doesn't become a shock to the congregation? So we put the drum cage around the digital drums, and then we removed the cymbals. and then we removed, so then we removed like the snare, and so like piece by piece we brought in a acoustic drum set, and they never even knew that it happened. And so we did all the removals in the middle of the night too, by the way. So I think sometimes you gotta, but I'm serious about this. The reason why I mentioned that story is it was slow. So we didn't like do it overnight. Like we were like just getting them used to, okay, there's something looks different up there. I don't know what it is, but I'm not gonna make it a big deal. So I just think you got to move slowly through that process, but maybe just consider like, how do I do this and move them forward without like ripping the Band-Aid off? I hope that's helpful.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left. Anything else that's you're just dying to ask? All right. Well, Chad, what's the last thing you want to share with that? What's on your mind? Like, you know what? I need to remember to say this.
So, I'll say this, in a room full of worship leaders. Is this seminary students or is this college
This
students?
is actually, I meant to say this at the beginning. We have undergraduates, we have seminary students, and there are also doctoral students. And we've got people in the room, and also people, you can tell when James zapped in, other students that are on Zoom also. So
nice.
This is a big collective conversation we have every week.
Yeah. So I'll say two things in leaving. Number one is, there is a great church in North Carolina called Calvary Baptist Church that will be open to internships if any of you would want to ever come to the beautiful state of North Carolina. So it's not as big as Texas, but it's a pretty cool place. We'd love to have you. And if you're ever coming through, please stop by. The second thing that I just say is just like, if I could go back in time, I would savor every moment that I had in ministry and savor what I learned from it. There were definitely some difficult years, I was in some challenging churches. I was in churches where they were in interims without pastors, and it was hard. It was tough. And that's another conversation for another time. But I would savor the times that I had, because you'll blink and you're on the other side of that. And you'll sit there and go, man, that was crazy how God did that. And you'll be reflecting on it, and you'll want to wish that you had lived in that moment more. And the last thing I would say is what I would do different is what I started with. I'd make the gospel the most important thing. Just all technology is going to ebb and flow, and it's going to leave. And, choirs are going to come in and out of fashion, and so are electric guitar players and whatever. Just make the gospel the most important thing, because that's what we're entrusted with to lead our people with. So be faithful with that. And, and then the other thing too is, don't be so concerned with whether you're in a small or a large church. Like one thing I didn't say was, when I moved from my very small church of 250 and went to the church of 800 people. And when I was in 250, I called a lot of local church pastors and just asked them if they would mentor me. None of them called me back. When I went to a church of like 800, 900 people, they started calling me, introducing themselves. I was the same person at the 250 as I was to the 800, 900 member church. In a lot of ways, my time at the 250 was sweeter than my time at the 800, 900 member church. So don't get so caught up in big, better, whatever. Just be faithful where God's planted you.